Hi there, this is Colin McGarry, Walking D-Day, and today we're in Bayeux, talking about why it wasn't damaged. Bayeux is one of the main tourist attractions of Normandy. There's several reasons for this. One is its magnificent cathedral. The other is it's a good place to be based to visit the D-Day beaches, and it's also got the Bayeux tapestry, which is an embroidery, and it wasn't damaged. One of the few towns not to be damaged during the war. As usual, there's several stories about this, and we'll mention them all. Now, a German who was here during the war would have no difficulty finding the places he knew. Bayeux hasn't changed much. 2 days after Poitevin capitulated on the 16th of June, the German army walked into Bayeux along this street from Caen, past the Lion d'Or, and past the Aubourg, or the Corn Exchange. The Komandantatur was set up in Hôtel de Malherbe, Rue Coq, and the seminary, which is where the tapestry is now, was taken over by the Germans. That caused friction between the bishop and the Germans. Life went on pretty much as before for those who towed the line. The Third Reich was going to be here forever, so they wanted the people to accept their presence. But that was an impossible dream. The prefecture, the French authorities, and the German officers, they had to make a monthly report about the attitude of the French to the Germans. And both of them were unanimous. The French were waiting for the English to come and save them. And they didn't at all like the German presence. Even those that weren't actively involved in resistance carried out passive resistance. If an Allied airman was being buried, that would pull a big crowds. And once a film of a football match between Switzerland and Germany was shown, and when the Swiss scored a goal, there was great cheers, and when the Germans scored a goal, there was boos. So after that, the films are shown with the lights up. In spite of rationing, the people in Bayeux weren't too badly off for getting supplies. But you could get fined if your blackout windows weren't covered up enough. Of course, there was a curfew. Everybody had to be indoors by 8 o'clock. And the Canadian Ferguson, who was shot down, was buried at Saint-Martin-des-Entrées. There was a big crowd of people there for his funeral. As the crowd left the cemetery, they were stopped at the gate by German soldiers. Their papers were confiscated, and a week later 10 people were taken away to a concentration camp. Now, this place, which is now a restaurant, was an office where Frenchmen could volunteer for the German army. Fortunately, there were few volunteers. You had to be in good form and have a good dentition. Just across the street, where Carrefour is now, there was a haberdashery of Marthe Degaulle. She was an agent under Edward Lefebvre, responsible for the Bayeux sector of the Front National, not to be confused with the political party today. The Front National was a communist resistance group. In 1943, she was arrested and passed by Ravensbrück and Mauthausen. She survived and was back in Bayeux by April 1945. Further up the road, where it became Rue Saint-Malo, was the cycle shop of Guillaume Mercader. He was born in the Pyrenees, but he'd moved to Bayeux, where he had a cycle shop. He was a professional cyclist, which gave him the right to ride around, to train, and riding around gave him many opportunities to get information on the German troops. This was his cycle shop. He was deputy of Robert Delon, who was the head of the OCM resistance movement. Mercader later became the head. One of his deputies was a woman, Madeleine Bronlec. These offices of the local paper were used by TODT. They built the coastal defences and organised the obligatory work service. Frenchmen would have to report here to get their job assignment. Many clandestine newspapers were printed during the occupation. At the liberation, they could come out into the open. The Renaissance du Bessin was one such paper. Now, Robert Delant was a lawyer. He was in the resistance. His wife was as well. In 1943, the Gestapo turned up at his house to arrest him. His clerk said he was going to get him, but the both of them escaped. But they arrested his wife instead, and even though she was beaten, she didn't give him any information. And in February 1944, she was let go because she was pregnant. Chez Paulette was a cafe, even at that time, popular cafe. Another well-known resistant was Arthur Poitevin. He was born at Pont-Bessin and became blind at an early age, so he became a music teacher. He lived in Bayeux and he was part of the resistance, and because he was blind, the Germans didn't see any trouble with him walking around by the coast, and in company of a young boy who could tell him what he could see, he noted down many things about the German defences. But in 1943, the Germans turned up at his house here in Rue Quincangrogne and arrested him. He was taken to a concentration camp in France, or in Alsace, and Natzweiler, and then ended up in Degaulle. But he survived, and he was back in Bayeux in 1945. Now, the most renowned story is of Dom Aubourg. He was the priest at the convent at Saint-Vigor, just outside Bayeux. Now, during the 6th, it looked like the Germans were going to make a stand against the Allied invasion. But during the night of the 6th, there was sounds of vehicles, and the Germans moved out. So on the 7th, Dom Aubourg went to meet the British troops at the crossroads of Saviour on the way to Gold Beach. And he told them that the Germans had left Bayeux and they could come in without bombarding the place. And an hour later, there were tanks coming down the streets. Of course, there's never just one version of a story. Some children by the Botanical Gardens here, they met some British troops coming from the direction of Pont-Bessin, and they told them that the town was full of civilians, and so the story goes that the British officer contacted a plane and stopped a bombing raid. Not sure if that one's true. And then of course there was Guillaume Mercader, who was already in contact with the British troops. Now these three versions are probably all true. Anyway, Bayeux was taken with just a small skirmish near the police commissariat, which is contiguous to the town hall, just here. So there's just a few bullet marks left. And the German troops who now surrendered had to be protected by the British troops. The seminary, which had been taken over by the Germans, was now used by the British as a hospital. There were also field hospitals, and even though there was no fighting at Bayeux, it became the site of the biggest British cemetery in Normandy. Now, one disadvantage of taking a town and not being damaged is that when the town is badly damaged, like Saint-Lô or Caen, to get through it, you just bulldoze away. But Bayeux, being a medieval town, had narrow streets and they're all intact, so it's very difficult to get tanks and trucks through the streets. And so the British built the bypass around the town in 3 weeks. And they did it by using matting like they used on the beach and for making airfields. And after the war it was made into a proper road. And it was the main road around Bayeux up until 2003 when they finished the 4-lane highway. The British troops that took Bayeux was the 50th Northumbrian Division from Northumberland. Their sign was TT for Tyne Tees, two rivers in Northumberland, and they like to show the troops where to go with the sign. They did that at Vers-sur-Mer and here. And only trace the Germans left as their presence in Bayeux was this bunker. It wasn't a casemate for a gun, it was just a shelter apparently, but it did have a machine gun position on the top there, and the entrance would be up first a steel rung ladder, then those steps. Now this is to the north of Bayeux, towards the coast, because at the time this would just be fields here, as aerial photo shows of 1950s. Montgomery moved into his HQ at Crully on the 7th. A week later he had a visit of Churchill, then Degaulle, then King George. Degaulle landed at Clauseul and was driven to Crully by Canadian Major Sanderson. As he left the chateau, Montgomery said to take Degaulle back to the ship. As soon as they got out of the grounds, Degaulle said, "We'll go to Bayeux." So Sanderson had no choice but to go to Bayeux. They stopped the jeep at the end of Rue Saint-Jean, and Degaulle strode up the road amongst the excited crowd. They at last could put a face on the voice they'd heard on the BBC. So General de Gaulle came up the main street, and then he came along Rue de Genaudet. He crossed over here, which was then the Place du Château, to the sub-prefecture. So after meeting with the prefect in the sub-prefecture over there, he came back here under the trees to give the people shelter in case of an eventual bombing raid, and made a speech. And they put this column up afterwards to commemorate the place. In 1946 he came back to the same place to make a speech to commemorate the first one. It's now called Place de Gaulle.